Consider him. And then when he was 30 years old, it came time for him to fulfill his earthly ministry. He became a teacher, and they called him Rabbi and Master. And he spoke to his disciples about the things of God. And he spoke to the people about the love of God and how God was going to save them from their sins. And he spoke about his death. The one who spoke life was now speaking about his own death. He said, "If I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto me." The Bible says that he came unto his own, but his own received him not. He was sent to the lost sheep of Israel, the people to whom God had sent prophets in the past, whom they abused and murdered. He sent to them his son. And they didn't like his words, and they didn't like the things that he was trying to say and do. And they were afraid that he would take over, that he would lead the people away from them. He came unto his own, but his own received him not. And then they lied about him. And then they apprehended him in the Garden of Gethsemane, the place of the olive press. It is where Jesus was being pressed as his fleshly self agonized with his spiritual mission to do the will of God, to give his life on the cross of Calvary. And he said, "Let this cup pass from me." And as he said it, he sweat great drops of blood. He was being pressed out of measure. He had to resign himself to the will of God. Consider him, the Bible says, who endured such contradiction of sinners against himself. He said to them, "You cannot take my life from me, but I lay it down of my own self." He said, "I could at any time call 12 legions of angels, and they would come to my rescue." But as the song says, he didn't come down. He didn't come down. No, he stayed on the cross. He endured the contradiction of sinners against himself. He said he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. There in the garden, when they came to apprehend him, he said, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "We come for Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "I that speak to you am." In the King James, the word "he" is italicized, which means it wasn't in the original text. He said, "I that speak to you am. I am." And the Bible says they all fell down backward. Consider him today. They led him away to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. He was given a trial, but he was never allowed to speak for himself. He wasn't able to defend himself, but nor would he, because he knew how this was all going to end. Even though he wasn't guilty, he opened not his mouth. The Bible said he was led away as a lamb to the slaughter. When Pilate said to him, "Don't you know I have the power to set you free?" He said, "You don't have any power except God gives you the power." And so Pilate caved to popular opinion. He brought him out to be judged by the people. They had a custom of delivering someone to them during the Passover that had been a prisoner. They brought out Barabbas and they brought out Jesus. And he said, "Why don't you make your choice? Whoever you choose today, I'll release to you." And the people said, "Give us Barabbas." And he turned and he said, "What about this man?" And they said, "We want you to crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" Pilate really didn't want to crucify Jesus. But to appease the crowd, he let it happen. And he went over and he washed his hands. And he said, "I wash my hands of this." You've all seen it. And then Jesus was ridiculed by the soldiers. The Bible says that he was spat upon or spitten upon by a band or a battalion of men. Can you imagine being slapped around and a crown of thorns crammed upon your head? And the blood began to make rivulets down the side of his head. And they beat him. And the Bible says his face became marred, his visage, or his face was marred more than any man's. He was beaten beyond recognition. And after his beating, and after this humiliation from the soldiers, after being flogged by a cat of nine tails, this wounded and beaten shell of a man was compelled to carry a cross. I don't know how he did it. I don't know where the strength came from. But when I think about it, when I consider him, the strength came from his undying love for sinful man. The strength came for his undying love for you and I. And he carried his cross toward Calvary. The writer of Hebrews said, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. And when he could no longer physically carry his cross, a man was compelled to carry it for him, Simon. And he carried it to the hill. And there at the base of Calvary, the Roman soldiers pounded the nails into his hands and into his feet. And these nails, they weren't the smooth nails that you can buy at a hardware store now. They more likely resembled a railroad spike, kind of square and made of iron, and they were beaten into his hands and into his feet. And I don't believe Jesus yelled out. I believe that he silently received the punishment. In his mind, he knew what it was all about. Even though it was so painful in the flesh, he knew he wasn't suffering for his own misdeeds, for he had never committed a sin. But he was suffering for you and I. And he could look toward the joy set before him by the Father. of redeeming mankind from their sins. And for this joy, he experienced the pain of the cross. And they lifted him up and stuck that cross in the ground with a thud. I can't imagine the pain that he suffered as he shifted his weight between the nails in his feet and hands. And for 6 hours hung there on the cross, suffering for you and I. We might look at this scene and say it is the tragedy of all time. But the Bible tells us to consider him who endured all of this contradiction of sinners. Analyze this and realize what was happening. Yes, it was ugly. Yes, it was pitiful. Yes, it was cruel and painful. But consider what was happening. He was purchasing our salvation with his own blood and purchasing our healing by his own suffering. By his stripes we are healed. The author of Hebrews says, consider all of this. Analyze it all, lest you be wearied in your mind, lest you think it's too hard for you. Consider him who gave all. He left glory. He came to earth. He suffered on the cross to make life for us easier and to grant us passage into heaven when we close our eyes in death. Because by his blood, he purchased our salvation. And in the book of Revelation, when John saw him, he said, I am he who is alive and dead, but I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of hell and of death. He said, I have the power now over hell and over death itself. And I am alive, and I will raise up everyone who believes in me on that day. And how about you today? Consider him. Who is he to you? Is he just a story in a book that you heard as a child? Or is he real? And did all of this happen just like the Bible says it did? And what does that mean to you today? If you're not saved, why don't you give your heart to Jesus? It's a simple thing. You just bow your head and pray and say, Jesus, come into my heart and into my life and save me from my sins. And if you do that, he'll do his part. He will come in. He will save you and give you a new life. Aren't you tired of the old sinful life? Don't you want to live the life that he bought for you and purchased on the cross of Calvary? Consider him. Analyze him. And when you do, you will see that he was indeed the Son of God and that he is alive today to save to the uttermost all that will call unto him and receive him by faith. God bless you.